The Chatham Cup is New Zealand's annual version of England's FA Cup, and the nationwide competition was first held in 1923, the final being held at Athletic Park in Wellington. The game was contested by local team Wellington YMCA, and from down south, Seacliff, yes, the sleepy seaside village located 30 kilometres north of Dunedin, a population roughly 1,000 at the time, the great majority of which were involved with the local lunatic asylum, the committed and institutionalised if we get picky. The team was almost exclusively attendants, doctors and staff from the hospital. This is what they look like in their day jobs as attendants. Mo's were clearly in at the time. Two of the players from that team would go on to represent New Zealand at international level. For the record, Seacliff won in convincing fashion, 4-0. The team would also go on to represent the South Island in 3 more finals, losing all 3. Hardly what one thinks of when the term Seacliff is mentioned today. And just one look at the Scottish baronial style building and you get a sense of foreboding. Looks, however, can be deceiving, certainly when this photo was taken. At the time it was finished in 1884, it was the largest public building in New Zealand. Took 4.5 million bricks to construct. Still, if you got Mary Shelley, Tim Burton and Christopher Lee in the same building and asked them to design a backdrop for a horror movie, this would be a contender. The depiction of Seacliff Mental Hospital I'm about to present to you is at sharp odds with the public's perception of the institution today. The modern narrative of which permeates around the author Janet Frame's time there, 45 to 53. Bad news in the form of lobotomies and electroshock treatment tends to strike a chord rather than musical productions in the hall, which could sit 600, walks on the lawn and growing tomatoes and cucumbers in greenhouses. Seacliff today is largely painted as a house of horrors, which to some extent it became for some. Importantly, after the tenure of its first superintendent, his name and that of his wife Isabel are all but forgotten today. Not though his and her legacies.
Bathing's fun, but feeding's a serious business, and another Jane settles down with the right degree of concentration. Affection plays its part in helping a baby's recovery, for each nurse has her own baby to look after and mother. With 6 hospitals and 100 nurses trained each year, it's a far cry from 1907, when Dr. Truby King, his wife and 1 nurse started to care for half a dozen ailing babies. Now Plunket and Karitane are our household words, and New Zealand babies are among the world's best cared for.
Karitane nurses. The first Karitane hospital was established in the couple's converted holiday cottage on the Karitane Peninsula, thus the name. Then there's the Plunket Society. That's my Plunket book, by the way. At 4 weeks I was a strapping 8 pounds 10 with a massive 14-inch chest, which hasn't grown much since actually. That individual in question is Sir Frederick Truby King. Plunket and Karitane nurses were his babies, pun intended. What he is best known for, his time at Seacliff hardly gets a mention in the shadow of those 2 rather large totara trees. Yet King's health reforms began there, at a place now listed as one of the country's most haunted, Seacliff. Born in New Plymouth in 1858, King followed his father into banking, then got unsurprisingly rather bored and trotted off to train as a doctor in Scotland. After returning to New Zealand with his new wife Isabella, and spent time at Wellington Hospital. In 1889, King successfully applied to get the job as the medical superintendent at Seacliff. He was considered at the time to be a reformist, and his appointment was somewhat against the odds, and he had his detractors. Reform he did. In those days, lunatic asylums were fairly grim places, glorified prisons. At what later became Karitane Lunatic Asylum in Auckland, 1 in 50 would commit suicide annually. This was a time when you could get, and did get, committed for being an alcoholic, of being of low intelligence, or what was called feeble-mindedness, epilepsy. For its time, and under King's 3-decade stewardship, Seacliff was a very enlightened institution. He definitely threw away the established doctrine. Housed a patient population of 500 to start off with, and over time that doubled. In a year, only 16 attempted escapes, and it had a rough ratio of 1 to 6 patients, which I'm confident is a decent ratio today. King's philosophy was centred around physical health as much as mental health. Patients were involved working on the grounds, in the gardens, orchard, greenhouses, running the farm, which was not an inconsiderable 1,000 acres, and clearing bush. There was a blacksmith, bootmaker, plumber, seamstress, etc., and a whole range of other skilled professions for occupants to lead productive lives when they left. Food-wise, the place was largely all but self-sufficient. The male ward had 2 billiard rooms and the female counterparts a sewing room. There was also an extensive library. Cricket games occurred on the front lawn in summer and football in winter. In case you were wondering, the cricket team was nowhere near as successful as the footballers. Privileges were earned. The hospital owned a fishing trawler, and pleasure cruises were one of those. The trawler also lived up to its built purpose, adding to the diets of staff and patient with smoked fish on site, and even distributed it to other hospitals like Dunedin. Work parties were Spartanly supervised. Violence of any kind by the staff outside self-defence wasn't tolerated and would result in instant dismissal. At night, the staff and patients would often occupy the main hall together. They were there to treat and rehabilitate, not punish. For the times, the staff had rather plush cottages, a fairly lively social life. What were termed criminal types, and those patients that had propensity towards violence, they were given their own secured yard, which is far away from the modern prison yard one can imagine. There were indeed fences for those people, within 3 exclusive acres, trees and gardens, a view of the ocean. This was the first facility of its kind in the country where people in need could knock on the door and say, "Check me in, I need help." Likewise, for the first time, patients who were progressing, they were released temporarily into the community for weekends and holidays, that sort of thing. Nor did King rest on his laurels. In between bouts of tuberculosis and ill health, ironic I know, he travelled overseas on what we would now call sabbaticals. It was in Japan at the end of one trip the couple got the idea to adopt some of the nurturing customs they encountered there, rejig them and bring them back to New Zealand. This is where Karitane and Plunket sprung from. Of course, when you're experimenting and you have somewhat of a free rein, in hindsight, not everything went to plan. He was a harsh taskmaster, would take others to task, yet it was renowned as a shoddy dresser who on occasion would forget appointments altogether. And like Kate Shepherd, King was a believer in eugenics, didn't want undesirables breeding, held a belief that females weren't up to things like kicking footballs around or farming in the fields. Inside Seacliff, things were sorted out along gender roles that were expected to be encountered in the wider society at the time. Unlike the unwarranted darling of modern feminists, Shepherd, who gets a get-out-of-jail-free card all the time, King gets a lot of stick for his belief on that front. At that time, though, social Darwinism was the norm. He also wasn't one for a jolly good wank, and condoms were a no-no as well. Perhaps that's why every morning there was a ritual for all patients: cold water baths. Truby and Bella King did arguably more for the country's women, certainly more for the children, than Shepherd ever did. Bella King's weekly column, Our Babies, was a staple in most newspapers. That's before you even get to Mr. King's work in researching and lecturing about childhood diseases, the countless lives saved there, undertaking a 6-month tour of the country to promote Plunket, and developing an infant formula, making health authorities aware epileptics weren't actually mentally ill and shouldn't be locked away, writing guides on animal husbandry, becoming a world expert in rhododendrons. In 2022, the King's contribution, with it the role Seacliff played fomenting those healthy lifestyle beliefs, diet and exercise, treating patients with respect, reforming the way we now look at mental health, becoming the first civilian to receive a state funeral in 1938, are all, sadly, but forgotten. Cripes, when he went for a marriage licence a century ago, a complimentary copy of his book was placed in your midst. You're likely today to hear more innuendos and spooky stories that post-date his time at Seacliff than his, or for that matter her, incredible legacy. Nor has the important role Bella played been given the kudos it deserves either. And this proud Plunket baby would go as far as saying it's a bit of a travesty. Thanks for tuning in today. If you're new to the channel, hopefully I've earned your subscription. It would be gratefully appreciated. Bye for now.